everyone. I'm back in the shop and it's time to work on the crank, so it's everything crankshaft in this episode. And today we're going to put a new race on into the crank for the belt pulley bearing. So we got to heat that up and see if we can pull that off, and then heat a new one up just a little bit and slide it back on. And I got the crankshaft tied to the anvil here, so it's pretty stable. So I don't want it to fall over. I just had everything machined and everything's like brand new on it. So we'll fire up the torch and see what a little heat does from the hot wrench. Okay. Didn't quite need to heat it up that much, but it'll shrink back down and be good and tight. That wasn't so tough, was it? So while I'm here, I'm going to put the gear on the belt pulley also, so I'll set up and get that done. I've got my key already in there, snap ring on there, so the gear's got to go clear down to the snap ring and mesh with the key. I've got my gear all cleaned up, brand new gear. You can also put these in the oven to like 500 degrees for an hour or so and run it out and slip it on. I've left both the crankshaft and the belt pulley out overnight in the cold shop. It's probably down to 15 degrees, and we'll get this thing heated up to about 500 degrees. I'm going to just try to heat it from the inside because I know it's been heat treated to make the gears harder. So I'm going to try to heat it from the inside. Try not to disturb that heat treatment too much. Try that. Okay, just like that. Make sure my keyway is down. Okay, you got to make sure you got the right diameter gear for the belt pulley, because Deere did change the diameter of that somewhere in the late 20s. They went to a little bigger diameter. So you got to make sure you got the right gear and then the right gear to match it on the spline shafts so you don't get a lot of noise. So they're kind of match sets, and if you go by the numbers on them, this is a 967, and I think the spline shaft gear is like a 965, I think. But then they went to the earlier ones had a 365 gear on the spline shaft, and then the drive gear on the belt pulley was a 661. So it doesn't always hold true, but anyway, just you got to make sure you got the right diameter gear for the belt pulley. That's all we have to do for the shop right now. We'll let these cool down, and then we'll move back into the assembly room. Okay, I'm back in the assembly room and going to start installing the crankshaft. This is the right-hand main bearing housing. That was a new old stock piece, and we need to start by putting the oil fitting in it. And then this bolt hole goes up through here, so got to make sure you put that correctly orientated so the clamping set screw can be screwed down in there. Now I'm not putting any gasket on here. The book doesn't say that there's any gasket. Once again, there's oil on both sides of this housing, so a little bit of seepage back and forth. And this is actually oiled all in here in the first reduction by the crankcase oil anyway, so it's all the same oil. There's a lip that fits into the crankcase, so it's pretty well centered as it's installed. Once again, might have to swap some bolts. That one's pretty good there. This one looks, well, that might be a little past. They're all a little past. Try to get the wire holes orientated to make it easier to put the wire in, but we'll swap a couple bolts here and see if it makes any difference. Where my wrench jumped to here. That one's the same every time. This would be probably a good one to tie to, so don't have enough. I've got the housing here that goes down in here. Just need to put some sealer on that. And then it's got to go in so the outlets are towards the front and to the side. You don't want to hide those back behind over on this side. And this is the early version of the oil gauge, where all the innards of it go in from the top. After 25, they made it so all the innards and the plunger came out the bottom side. Try to keep stuff from this hole, because if you drop it down in there, it's tough to get it out of there. So now comes, oh, I already made a mistake. This line has got to go down through to the oil pump, and I don't think you can get that in there. I need to turn that lower fitting so it matches up with the oil gauge. There we go. Okay, I took the oil gauge back out. I had to put this fitting in there, and then make sure your holes are to the front and to the right side of the crankcase. And then you got to feed that down through this pipe here. So now we got the oil line in that fitting and the fitting down there. And then what I use is some packing. Strand of packing that I unwind off the larger piece of packing, and kind of have to guess at how long you need it. But if you wrap it around the way the nut goes, so it'll tighten up as you tighten up the nut. And then try to get the one down on the lower end. Didn't have a new pipe for this one here. The other two pipes are new. And the lower fitting is new. The top fitting was not new, but the gauge body is new. And I'm hoping that I can find the innards before I have to start up and get a new plunger for the oil gauge. You want to be careful not to break those fittings off. Hopefully this fitting will go on the side there. Unscrew that again. It won't let me turn all the way around back in there. That's close. It's going to go around. Okay, it's supposed to be about straight down somewhere in there. Okay, now these new lines, you got to bend them so they fit. I kind of patterned it off of the old one, an old one that I had. It's got to be clear back against that back. Back into the crankcase, because the rods come around in here, and if it sticks out in there, it'll catch it. We're getting close. It's very close. Now if I could keep track of all my wrenches, it's best to hold the back side as you tighten up the ferrule nut. Looks pretty good. I think we can put the crankshaft in now. Put a rag over this bearing housing. And if you remember, we marked this camshaft gear. Right there's the arrow. I think that crankshaft is going to test my strength. But you can't put in the bearing over on this side yet, because you need a lot of room to get that in there. That wasn't such a trial. Now I think I can put the bearing. I put just a little bit of water on this gasket. Now I'm ready to put in the left-hand main bearing housing. I've got it all. I got the gasket on. I got some gasket sealer around there. And once again, the bolt to draw down the main bearing clamp is up to the top up here. And this one, there is a gasket on it, so because of course we don't want grease coming out around the flange there. I'm going to put a little bit around the threads too. Keep them from leaking. And then I can put in the bearing shell. It's supposed to protrude from the clamp about 5/100ths or 5/1000ths. Make sure they're seated in there. Now, you got to get the crankshaft timed with the camshaft. And there's a dot. I'm 1 gear off. Okay, that's right according to the marks. Now I'll try to get this half in over here. Got to get it equidistance. Okay. What I did is kind of make sure the in play has got them seated side to side, and then kind of pound them down in there with the crankshaft just a little bit. Now, this felt squeezes in around here to keep most of the oil from escaping out over the top of the bearing housing. Otherwise, it'll overload the slinger and you'll have some leaking going on. So that'll slide right in there. I think I will put a little oil in there. And then a shim pack goes in there. The notch goes towards the crankshaft. Flush all the way around there. Gonna have to tighten that up, aren't I? Got my marks lined up. I will put the other bearing in the other side. Okay, like that. And then get some oil. Looks like I didn't fix myself a nut for that. By the book, it says as the throw is coming up, the lobe on the, that seems like it's right. The timing marks are together, and the orientation of the first journal for the piston number 1 is just almost a dead top, probably about 20 degrees from dead top, just the way it is in the picture right here. And that's when the left-hand exhaust should start to open. So I think I can tighten these down and see if I can still turn everything. One thing I forgot is to put in my oil line gland. I think I can get that in here pretty easily. Okay, I think I'll reset so you can watch me do the other side. So I put the belt pulley on to see if everything was going to line up, and it looks like everything will be good. And then I'm working on putting the oil line on here. Got to tighten up that ferrule. And I lined up the cam gear to the crank gear. And tightened up the bolts on the crank or on the cam gear and wire tied them. And then I was going to show you the mark on the crank right there. I've got to go around again. So when you're timing the crank to the cam, there's a dot on the crankshaft there and an arrow on the cam gear, and they have to mesh. And then to make sure that you're right on, it really needs to have the flywheel on. So you can check the mark on the flywheel right here with the mark on the spline shaft cover, or in this case, the PTO cover. There'll be a mark about right in here that mark on the flywheel will come to. And then this is the oil slinger that goes on here on the crankshaft, and then the cover that goes on that. What I had them do at the machine shop, I had them put in another groove in there, an eighth inch groove for an O-ring, because on these early tractors they didn't have any protection from the oil coming out over the crankshaft. This is the first groove, is where the oil is supposed to drop into and then sling back into the crankcase. But I had them put another groove in there, and I'm going to put an O-ring in there. Because later down the road, I think in 28, when they went to the bigger engine, they put a cork gasket in there in the oil slinger. Right in here, they put a groove for a cork gasket to go in there. So the early ones didn't have anything there for protection, so I'm going to try that. I've been doing it on my GPs. And then here is a bearing kit that I bought a year or so ago from a fella. And it's got the rods. Can't see it very well. It's got the rods and mains in boxes and the shim package. And the newspaper says 1945. So I imagine that came back from the 40s. I didn't use any of the parts out of there. I was going to keep that as is. That's a neat box. So we're getting most of the bolts used up on the crankcase. Once I get the crankshaft finished, I'll probably start on the block and the pistons and try to get those hooked up, and then put on the governor housing. So I'm back over on the flywheel side to finish up putting on the oil slinger and putting the cap on and then maybe sliding the flywheel on. And I wanted to show you right in here, I put an O-ring, I had a lip, or a groove, there it is right there, that I had the machinist put a groove in there, an 1/8 inch wide, 1/8 inch deep, and then I got an O-ring that's just about 3 inches inside diameter from John Deere, and I am going to push that down in there. And then you want to make sure that you're within this ridge back here beyond the keyway, because if you go across the keyway, of course it's not going to seal it up, but so you got to be back on this behind the keyway. I'm going to try to put just a little bit of oil on there to make it slip on. I got my keyway here that fits into this notch here to run the oil slinger, and it's orientated this way. And I made a little punch right there so I know exactly where that's at. Should be right there. Because once you put the cap on, you're not going to be able to move that. And then I've got my gasket on there with some sealer. It's all ready to be put on. These bolts, they don't go into oil, so I don't need to put any sealer on those. So this bearing housing was new. This piece is new, a new oil slinger. It's pretty much new except for the crankshaft. And then you want to lift that up and center it on the slinger. This was before John Deere used dowels to center their castings. So you gotta kind of center it while you tighten it up. Back 100 years ago, fitting castings together was not an exact science. Okay, then we got a D200R keyway. Get the keyway started first. I'm just putting the flywheel on so I can turn the crank while I'm hooking up the rods. And this is just temporary black paint that the machinist put on there so it wouldn't rust. So I'm gonna have to wait for warmer days to paint the flywheel. And I really don't need to put it on all the way. I just want to get it on there where I can turn the crank. So I'm ready to get the block cleaned up and the pistons, and get the pistons on the rods and insert those into the block. And my next video will be doing some of that work and then installing the block on the front of the case and hooking up the connecting rods. So we'll see you on the next episode, and we'll see you down the road.